Please join me in welcoming them here today.
Thanks, Christina. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to be running down our latest poll, the results from the poll. I have a lot to present, so I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as I can, and certainly I'll be available to answer any questions that you have at the end, and I'm sure the discussion will focus on some of the results that were shown. Great. All right, this was a poll that was completed in late October. This is our final pre-election poll. And let me tell you a little about the poll. And Ezra, it's not advancing. Excuse me, technical glitch. Okay, a little technical information about the poll. The poll was conducted October 25th through the 31st. This is by the University of California's Institute of Governmental Studies with funding from the LA Times. These surveys are done self-administered online in English and Spanish. We don't do them by telephone. We do them by distributing email invitations to random samples of voters whose email address is on the voter rolls. It's a public record, so we're just randomly sampling off of the voter rolls. The poll itself includes a random sample of over 7,600 registered voters statewide, but because we wanted to also examine the results in LA City and LA County, we did an augmented sample within those two areas. We ended up with over 1,400 interviews in the city of Los Angeles, or surveys in the city of Los Angeles, 3,600 surveys in LA County. The results are then weighted to bring those oversamples back to the statewide totals, and then we weight the entire statewide sample by a number of different variables so that the statewide survey is in direct relationship and proportion to the population characteristics as we know them of the state's registered voters. So it's as good a survey as we can put together. First, I'm going to show you the results of voter preferences in the statewide elections, and then I'll go through the LA mayor and LA County sheriff's race. First, at the top of the ticket, no surprise here, we have Gavin Newsom comfortably ahead in his bid for re-election. Our latest poll is showing a 21-point lead for Newsom. That's very similar to what we saw in late September, so not a lot of movement going on in this particular race. He's well ahead, and I think he's probably going to be re-elected. One of the big reasons for that is that he is almost universally well known in the state. 55% have a favorable opinion of him, 42% unfavorable, just 3% don't know who he is or couldn't rate him. On the other hand, his challenger, 42% of likely voters 1 week before the election had no opinion of Brian Dolly. All right, when we look at the propositions that were included in this poll, we included 5 of them, and it appears to us that 2 of them appear likely to pass. The first one is Proposition 1, which is the reproductive rights constitutional amendment, almost 3-to-1 support, 64% to 27%. The other one is at the bottom, Proposition 31, which is just upholding an existing state law banning flavored tobacco products. That also is ahead, but 58% to 32%, it's almost 2-to-1. Those 2 look comfortably ahead. The 2 sports wagering initiatives, on the other hand, are not faring well at all. In fact, when you look at Proposition 26, this would be sports wagering on tribal lands. It's behind 53% to 30%, and Proposition 27, which would allow online sports wagering, even further behind, 64 to 22%. And what's significant to me is that the no side has increased its margin proportion by 11 points on each of these initiatives over the past month. So the direction is definitely going to the no side. The one area that does seem to be still in play, or the one proposition that we measured, is the tax on millionaires. This would go for zero emission vehicle programs. The governor has come out against this, whereas the Democratic Party and most labor unions are in favor. So it's an interesting dichotomy in terms of who's taking which sides. But we're only showing 47% support It is ahead 47 to 41 in our final poll, though when it's less than 50%, my experience in polling is that it's in jeopardy. Many voters who are undecided in the very late stages of an election campaign, on propositions anyways, tend to vote no. They haven't been sold on the initiative. So I would say this could go either way. All right, now let's turn to the LA mayor's race, which is a very hot race in LA. Front page news today in the LA Times. We had, in late September, we had Bass fairly comfortably ahead, 46 to 31% among likely voters, 23% were undecided. However, in our poll that we just completed, it's now just 4 points. We have Bass at 45, Caruso at 41, with 14% undecided. So this could go either way. I mean, these are two snapshots in time. When you see that kind of closing 1 week before the election, it's probably going to be very close. And one of the things that we'll be looking at is who votes. I think, you know, the turnout, the shape of the turnout really will affect the actual winner. If you can look around on this particular slide, there's big differences by race and ethnicity. In fact, one of the reasons why Caruso has now closed the gap so much is that he's now favored by 17 points among Latino voters, who, according to our sample, is 30% of the likely electorate. That's a big change from September, when he was about even, I think he was slightly behind Bass in late September among Latinos. White voters are almost evenly divided in this race. Blacks and Asian Americans are very heavily in favor of Bass. When you cast a ballot is going to be a factor. And so when you're watching the election returns on election night, you always have to remember there's a lot of votes still left uncounted in California elections. Well, it matters. Among those who had already voted by the time we did the survey, it was very close. We had Caruso leading by 3 points. That was 18% of the sample. And when you look at the voters who think they're going to go to the polls in person on election day, Caruso is well ahead. So he's going to do well on election day, but all the other voters who vote by mail or drop off their ballot, those are the voters that are most likely to be voting for Bass. The poll also included asked voters in LA City about 6 issues that are important in the election. And we had 2 different questions. First, how important are each of these issues? And we've arrayed them in their order of importance. On the very left-hand margin is the proportion who rate each issue as being highly important to their decision about who they're going to support for mayor. And then we're showing the percentages on the perceptions of voters as to who would do a better job in handling this particular issue. And what's significant to me is that Caruso does pretty well among the top issues facing many voters in LA. Homelessness, he's seen as doing a slightly better job than Bass, 40 to 31. He's also seen as doing a better job on crime and public safety, and also economic issues. Bass, on the other hand, is seen as likely to do a better job on education, climate change, and coalition building across races. So it's an interesting race. It divides voters along many different lines. In the LA County race for sheriff, we've done 2 polls, and the first one had the challenger, Luna, ahead by about 10 points. The incumbent, Villanueva, was at 26% to Luna's 36%, with a large proportion undecided. We still have a large proportion undecided, but it does appear that the incumbent is in serious jeopardy. Villanueva is still polling behind Luna, 40% to 32%. And this despite the fact that many voters really don't have an opinion of Luna. So what I'm seeing on the data for the LA County Sheriff is most voters are making their decisions on this race based on how they view the incumbent. And as you can see, the incumbent's favorable, unfavorable, he's 9 points underwater. That correlates very closely to preferences in this race. Another part of our poll, and this is a significant report that we're going to be issuing tomorrow, has to do with political divisiveness and threats to voting and the election process, and asking California voters on these number of issues. The first slide shows that 2/3 of both Democrats and Republicans in California believe that political divisions in the US today are highly divisive. There's no real argument about that. Most people believe they're to some extent divisive. Just 4% say they're not divisive at all. And then we asked a statement that actually was posed in a NPR Ipsos poll earlier this year. Do you agree or disagree with the statement, American democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing? Again, no real disagreement on this. Both Democrats and Republicans are in agreement overwhelmingly. And if you compare this to the national findings, Californians are even more likely to agree. I think the NPR poll had it at 70% agreement. We have it at 78%. And also, both parties, Democrats, Republicans alike, are pessimistic that Americans of different political viewpoints will be able to work out their differences. So there's a great deal of pessimism about what's now facing the American democracy. It's not just Democrats who are worried, Republicans are worried as well. And I think that's really one of the main findings. There's quite a bit of agreement that there's a problem and that there's no easy solution. All right, let's look at some of the specific threats. Election security. We asked about whether this would be, did voters believe that security is strong, or do voters believe that security is under threat? Here you see that most voters, 52% of all voters, think it's under threat, compared to 35% who say it's strong. And it's mostly Republicans who are concerned about election security, or at least have concerns about election security. Democrats are about evenly divided. And then we asked people, well, here are 5 potential problems, and would you rate them on as being a major threat, a minor threat, or not a threat in terms of the nation's election processes? And 4 of the 5, a majority of California voters believes pose a major threat to the nation's election processes. At the top of the list, people threatening violence. If they don't get what they want, 73% believe that's a major threat. People trying to overturn or change election results, 64% rate that as a major threat. Organized efforts aimed at making it harder for Americans to vote, 63%. Foreign interference, about half of voters call that a major threat. And then people casting ballots illegally, about a third, a little more than a third, 39% see that as a major threat. But here's where we start to see divergences between the two parties. It gets to the specifics that are the threats facing the election processes. If you look at the Democrat and Republican columns, the 3 potential threats that are far greater concern to Democrats than Republicans are the top 3. Political violence, people trying to overturn or change election results, organized efforts aimed at making it harder to vote. 3/4 or more of Democrats consider those major threats. Among Republicans, making it harder to vote is only seen as a major threat by a third of voters, and only about half say the political violence or overturning elections as major threats. At the bottom of the list, only 25% of Democrats see people casting ballots illegally as a major threat facing our election system, but 69% of Republicans see that as a major threat. In fact, it's the number 1 among these 5 issues among Republicans. So very different viewpoints about your party affiliation on the threats that you see facing the election processes. Another big difference has to do with confidence that voters have in California about the accuracy of voting machine tallies in elections. This is just counting up the votes. 72% of all Californians say they have some confidence, or they are either very or somewhat confident in the accuracy of those counts. But interestingly, about a quarter do not. And if you see who doesn't have confidence, it's mostly Republicans. I mean, almost 9 out of 10 Democrats have confidence in the accuracy of these machine tallies. But among Republicans, it's less than half who are confident. And most of them say they're not too or not at all confident about these election tallies. Okay, and then a 2-to-1 majority of Californians also believe that voting rights are under threat in California. Both Democrats and Republicans kind of share that view, although Democrats are more likely to say that. But again, another threat facing the nation's elections. And that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer all your questions as soon as we're done. Thanks.
And as you're getting situated, why don't we just sort of jump in? Why don't we just start with Dave? Dave, what do you think? What was most striking out of the data, both sort of the poll data and sort of your knowledge of the national scene? What do you think was most striking there?
Well, thanks. Want to express our appreciation to the Institute for doing this panel, but also for the tremendous job that Mark has done over the last several years on the polling, which has been a huge resource for California and for educating people about issues of concern. I guess two things jumped out at me as being particularly notable. One was what Mark was just talking about at the end of the presentation there, the divergence of views about what the threats are to democracy. Democrats have made a major issue about democracy being under threat. And I think there's a lot of frustration on the Democratic side that they haven't gotten more electoral mileage out of that issue, that they've Biden did a major speech about democracy under threat in Philadelphia back on September 1st. He went back at the issue on Wednesday, and yet it seems that outside of the ranks of Democrats who already are on board, they haven't achieved a lot of, haven't persuaded a lot of people. And I think the data that Mark was showing goes a long way towards explaining why that Republicans also believe democracy is under threat, but they see it as being under threat from Democrats. So the issue has become a tremendously divisive one, and you can see it in those questions about organized efforts to prevent people from voting, which Democrats see as a major threat. Most Republicans do not. And people voting illegally, which Republicans see as a major threat. Most Democrats do not. It's very hard to see how you achieve any agreement on that issue when the partisans on either side have such diametrically opposed views about what's going on, which probably contributes to the pessimism that the poll found. It indicates that voters are wise to be pessimistic, I guess. And of course, the other thing that jumped out at me, partly because at the LA Times we're immersed in it, but also just because it's a really interesting dynamic, is how the race for mayor in Los Angeles has tightened in the last several weeks. Part of that is attributable to the enormous amount of money that Caruso has been able to spend in the election. One of the other findings that the poll had was that Karen Bass's favorability has declined. And when you have that much money being spent against you, you can expect that that's going to happen. But that's only part of it. I mean, the other part, as Mark noted, was the support that Caruso has gained among Latino voters in Los Angeles, and that's been a very important political dynamic. Whether it's going to be enough to carry him to victory in the election, we'll see. It looks like it's going to be very close, but it potentially presages a very different political coalition in LA from what we've seen over the past couple of decades. I'll stop there, and we can answer more questions later.
And what about you, Marissa? What are sort of striking findings that come up to you?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for all your work, Mark. I should say it's Marissa.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Marissa?
Marissa, yeah. Marissa. Yeah, I mean, I think to David's point, what's really like watching the slides come through, and I was just pouring over this poll this morning because we were lucky enough to get it early so we can have something on the air tomorrow. I don't even think Democrats and Republicans are answering the same question. Like they're agreeing on stuff, but what they mean by that agreement is completely different. And I think that that's really scary, honestly. And it's it's a challenge because like I was doing a 2A this morning about this and I was, repeating what we have said in the media repeatedly, which is that the election was not stolen in 2020 and that concerns about illegal voting are, overblown makes it sound like it's even an issue. I mean, study after study, you see the cases where people vote illegally, they get prosecuted. It's certainly not a partisan issue. In fact, I think more Republicans than Democrats have been. But how do you have that conversation? I mean, I am probably losing people as I talk, on the radio about this by just saying Donald Trump was lying about the 2020 election. To me, like this just poses the biggest challenge for all of us as individuals, and particularly those of us who make our living trying to communicate about politics, which is that we're not even speaking the same language right now. And I think that really is a challenge, and it's one that could be getting bigger with certain sale of a social media company right now and the political violence that we've seen over the last week. So yeah, that strikes me. I'll say, since David already covered the mayor's race, but I mean, I'll just say money talks. Like, I don't think you can take any other sort of takeaway from that other than the fact that when you spend $100 million, it can help sway public opinion. Because a lot of the factors in that race, I don't think have changed significantly over the summer. It's not like the national conversation where the Dobbs decision really played big in congressional races and then kind of faded away with economic questions. A lot of the issues people are voting on local races have been the same in California for years. Homelessness, public safety, housing, those sorts of things. I think the Vienna waiver race is really interesting to me, and it does show that sometimes incumbency can be a double-edged sword. Often it helps you keep your seat. We've seen this historically with sheriffs and DAs. These are races that until recent years we didn't talk about quite a bit. And actually there's a real big history in California of sheriffs and DAs always being incumbents, because when people retire, they often retire before the election and then handpick their successor. We saw that, I think Alameda County, this is the first time in 80 years that there's an open DA race. Vienna was just blown that out of the water. I mean, he's been such a divisive figure. I think it has to do partly with the fact that he came in with a Democratic coalition behind him and has really pushed them away with a lot of his policies and actions. But that it's almost like that's the inverse opposite of the mayor's race, where Caruso wasn't very well known for anything other than his developments, and has made himself known and really made the case that he can take on these issues. Which good luck, buddy. I mean, it's like how many millionaires do we elect? Who can't? One person can't fix it. LA doesn't have a strong mayor, so I think I worked with David when I was an intern in 2003 when Arnold Schwarzenegger came to power, and he fixed everything, right?
Yeah.
On that note, Eric, what do you think? We can share these mics if you want, so everyone can have mic. There you go.
All right. Thanks, Christina. And thanks, Mark, for your great work with the poll. I guess I'm going to talk just a tiny bit, or think about things just stepping back from the California and just thinking about the national picture. And I guess what I would say is striking is it's like we're having two different, maybe more than two, but at least two different midterms. And one is what I would call a normal midterm, which is like a lot of voting. When a normal midterm, party in power, the economy is not perceived to be great by voters, presidential approval not high, there's a backlash, out-party gains, backlash also often against the in-party having done policies that maybe push things too far. So there's a kind of equilibrating kind of aspect to elections. And I think that is definitely a big part of the story, right? And if it was, and that is the full story, you'd probably expect Republicans certainly win the House and gain 20, 30 plus seats. Senate is closer because of the map, but potentially the map favors Democrats, the seats up, but in midterm probably get the Senate and so on. And that's kind of what you would sort of political scientists talk about fundamentals. That's what we would think. Then there's another midterm though that says, well, this isn't really a normal midterm. Maybe we don't have any normal elections anymore in the US, I don't know. But in the sense that first, the most important the most salient policy change to happen didn't come from the president of Congress, came from the Supreme Court, the Dobbs decision, right? So normally there's a reaction against the party in power. In this case, they're if you think about highly salient policy changes, a big one came from the Supreme Court against the party in power. And then secondly, overlaid of that is January 6th and the aftermath of that. And so I think what Democrats have tried to do is make this an election about the Dobbs decision, an election about threats to democracy in the wake of January 6th. And I think, and the hope is that that mobilizes enough Democratic voters and swing voters to push against this normal expected midterm and give us something somewhat different, right? And I think what we're seeing now is just how hard it is to push against that normal midterm element, even in this situation, which clearly is not normal in many ways, right? And I think that's going to be the battle, and it's going to play out differently, quite potentially in different states. Like there's good reason to worry in states, well, for Democrats, one way to think about it for Democrats is in states where abortion is very visibly under threat, maybe that's going to help. They'll turn out their voters and maybe do better than expected. But in other states, where it's not seen as under threat, or other issues are more salient, especially in trouble. And so I think we're seeing multiple elections. But again, going back to Mark's point about democracy, this is a situation of genuine crisis, and a lot of the candidates who are going to win are candidates who very much enunciate, election truther kind of line about 2020. And so we're going to be living, so voters may be behaving as if it's a normal midterm, but it's not clear that that's, that might be due to not, paying sufficient attention to some of these other threats.
And Eric, how do those patterns map onto California, sort of whether it's normal or abnormal for Californians? We know that there are some congressional races that folks are looking at, out, for example, the Antelope Valley and other places. What do you think? How do those map onto California?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the concern. I mean, I was talking to David before the panel, and I think that that's a reason to be very nervous, because in a state like California, with those competitive, I mean, on the one hand, Democrats are constantly winning here. So in that sense, they can't do that badly, but in these closely contested House races, getting Democratic voters out in this context, I think, is going to be really hard. And I think we're seeing some evidence of that, in the early vote. So,
And actually, that was one of the reasons the governor put Proposition 1, the legislature put Proposition 1 on the ballot, to try to make sure that voters were thinking about reproductive rights as a top issue, and you got to get out to vote on Proposition 1. But whether that's going to have a big impact is still unknown.
It doesn't seem like people are that motivated. I think it was the PPIC poll that found just a few weeks ago, huge numbers of people just sort of unaware of it. Like Californians are happy to support abortion rights, but it wasn't that motivating factor. I was down in Delano a few weeks ago, where Democratic Assemblymember Rudy Salas is challenging David Valadao, which I think close to this. And yeah, it was like, you cannot turn on a television without just seeing ads hammering Salas over gas prices. And so, on the other hand, though, like, that's one of those races where he probably has a better chance than anywhere else. It's a 59%, I think, Latino district. It's Democrats have like a 17-point advantage. And so it's sort of the inverse of Caruso. Like the more liberal candidate there is really hoping Latinos turn out, because overwhelmingly that is a more sort of decisive group for Democrats. But, I think that 6 months ago, we would have thought it was going to be all Dobbs. And it's just not the issue. When I talked to the mayor of Delano, a young man who has been on the city council for a few years, he's like, people care about it, but that's not what's motivating them. And so I think that's going to be the real challenge. And yeah, just in recent weeks, we've seen an Orange County race, Katie Porter, who I think has raised more money than any other congressional candidate, like $23 million. There's worries there. Brownlee in LA, which is wild to me. I mean, I hadn't even heard of her challenger. And then, out in like Palm Springs, the Ken Calvert race, I think there was a lot of hope for Democrats, but we'll see. I mean, the only election, the only poll that matters, right?
David, any thoughts? I mean, you've been sort of covering.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to remember is Democrats have a lot of exposure in some of these districts in California. There are places like Katie Porter's district that Marissa was just mentioning, or Mike Levin's district, which straddles San Diego and Orange County. Those are areas that had been Republican. In the case of Katie Porter's district, had been Republican forever. And Democrats won those areas in 2018, which was a really good year for Democrats. The Antelope Valley district they won in 2018, lost 2020. They were kind of hoping they might be able to get it back. But again, this is another district that it's not, it's definitely not blue turf. It's maybe purple. And
For now, right?
for now, right?
yeah.
It could change, but for now. So these are areas where Democrats have a lot of exposure, and in a bad year for the party in power, those seats are going to be vulnerable. And so I think, we're seeing that. California and New York, both big states where abortion rights are very well protected, are both states in which Democrats seem to be in danger of losing seats. So it may be, as Eric was suggesting, that some of these sort of big blue states, some of that motivation of fear is just not there, because people don't, they may feel it as an abstract thing or solidarity with people in other states, but in terms of their own lives, not necessarily feel the motivation to come
Which
out
is
and vote.
wild, because all of the Republicans who are being, in these sort of swing districts are co-sponsors of the Life Begins at Conception Act, which is an attempt to ban abortion nationally. I just think it's crazy that even in this state, like, their challengers haven't been able to draw that line more clearly. When I interviewed Mike Garcia, who's up in Antelope Valley, northern sort of Santa Clarita, northern LA County, I mean, he voted, against certifying election results. He's very much in line with President Trump, co-sponsored that. He sort of was like, oh no, it's fine. You all can vote for Prop 1. And I'm like, but you oppose abortion. Like, and the fact that his opponent isn't kind of drawing that line, or at least it's not landing with voters, I think is really fascinating. And maybe speaks to Eric's point, but like, it just feels like that is something that they could have messaged more on, because
Do you think that's a line to draw, though, in California in some of these districts, when you're thinking of, for example, Garcia's district, you've got this large Latino population that has this sort of funny relationship to whether you're going to talk about sort of women's right to choose or abortion or things like that. Do you think this is a California sort of thinking about the big question mark around Latinos and around voters of color here, or?
I mean, the Times had an excellent story that Melanie Mason and Noah Berger reported out of New Mexico about this, and how I don't think the sort of traditional assumption that just because like Latinos equals Catholic equals anti-abortion is necessarily true. I think what you're actually seeing in California is much stronger abortion opposition among, say, like the Vietnamese and some Asian American populations that the Catholic Church has really messaged strongly around. I think it depends. I think that's really a question of like age, how long have you been here? And do you go to church? The Archdiocese in San Francisco, who's like, made a name fighting with Pelosi over giving her communion because of her pro-abortion stance. He talks really clearly about like, yes, overall, that like large numbers of Catholics actually support abortion access, but not large numbers of Catholics that actually go to Mass. So like there's a difference, right, between feeling culturally Catholic or culturally, Christian, and being, a church-going Catholic, or particularly evangelicals are overwhelmingly more leaning right, I think, these days.
Any thoughts on this, Eric?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think it's also, I mean, in terms of the messaging point, I think that is like the $64,000 question for Democrats. Like, could they have done a better job messaging about both abortion and democracy? And I think it's hard to know. I don't think there's really a consensus, say, from political science research about how much, in the face of a tough economy, how effectively can you get voters to focus on other kinds of issues? Should you, right? And is it better to try to speak to, especially say with Latino voters, you see a lot of evidence concern about the economy. So would it be better to speak to them about those economic issues? I don't think there's a clear answer. I think it is striking, though, the extent to which Republicans have succeeded in making the election more about the issues they want to talk about than the
Right.
issues Democrats would want to talk about.
Obama tried to do this, right? He's like, corruption equals like your pocketbook and democracy. I mean, it's like I think there's some messengers, but I think it is a hard line.
And there's a limit to how much you can swim against the tide, though. You can talk all you want about the issues you want to talk about, but if what's on voters' minds is, if you live in the Antelope Valley, for example, and you've got an hour-long commute, you worry about the price of gas. And, that's in your face every single day. And you may just say, you know what, things aren't working very well for me right now. I'm going to vote for the other party. We'll see what happens. And it's hard to change the subject,
Yeah.
I think, is part of the lesson of this election.
Yeah, maybe another part of whether this is a normal election or not normal election is not only January 6th and sort of the Supreme Court decisions, but also just inflation, right? Just also what's happened and what toll that plays. I don't know.
What's normal? I mean, really.
Exactly, that was the question. What's interesting is, whether there's a missed opportunity from Democrats, and it strikes me that I feel like every 4 years we're saying, or every 2 years we're saying the exact same thing. I don't think I've ever remembered a time in which we've said Democrats got it. Like they've got the message.
2008, maybe, right? Obama's first.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but Republicans also have a much more robust media landscape to push their messaging, right? I mean, what's interesting to me is
How do you describe that?
Yeah, so I mean, Fox News is the obvious, but I think the last few years there's been this proliferation of, OAN and all these other organizations, and you can say, well, MSNBC is liberal, but I think Fox News does a much more sort of like militaristic job of like pushing the message of the party versus like Democrats just like to like question their message, I think, a lot, especially publicly, which is always ironic, like right before the election, But I also think that like heading into this year, at the end of last year, I thought crime was going to be the biggest thing. Like that was the drumbeat. That was what was leading in San Francisco to the chase of the Dean recall. Remember all those viral videos? And I think that really shifted starting in the spring when things started getting really shaky around inflation and the supply chain and all of that. Dobbs kind of shook it up for a bit, but we've come back. And I just think like, the economy is clearly the biggest issue, but if you do turn on Fox News, they're also talking about crime, right? And so there's like these dual kind of messages that I think are landing with folks, especially those who are up for grabs.
And if you go to some of the swing states where there are big Senate races, Wisconsin being the prime example, you turn on the TV, that's all you see are ads about crime. The Republican candidate, the incumbent Ron Johnson, has been pounding away at Mandela Barnes, his opponent, on crime, and it's been very effective. And it's partly Barnes has given him some openings because of some of the positions that he's taken in the past, but it's also obviously when you're running against a black candidate in a majority white state, talking about crime is a way of talking about race without talking about race, and it is definitely taking a toll. And you see that issue also coming up in all of the races in New York. That's pretty much the only issue that the Republican candidate for governor, Lee Zeldin, has been campaigning on. So crime has remained a big issue in a lot of these races, and it over the years it has been a very effective issue for Republicans. The other thing I say about it is it connects to inflation in a way, because what upsets voters so much about inflation is partly simply the fact that prices are going up and it's harder to make a living, but it also gives people the sense that their lives are out of control, that things are not stable, and crime is a similar dynamic. It's the fear that the fear of your life not being in control, your neighborhood not being safe, and I think that's a powerful political weapon that the Republicans have effectively used. And, it's true that Democrats have had trouble countering it. It's also true that when you're the party in power, it's hard to counter it because you're responsible. If people are upset, they don't really want an argument about whether or not they should be upset. They want to take the fact that they're upset out on someone, and they're going to take it out on the people in charge.
What do you think about this, Mike? You've been polling Californians for a long time. Is crime, did you see crime as a big issue this year?
I think especially when you're talking about places, especially outside of California, the defund the police mantra really has been used as a hammer against the Democrats, I think, and especially and effectively. And I think that's, crime is one of these issues that I think it's relatively easy to arouse people about because you just have to bring out their fears. And I remember seeing a number of ballot propositions in the past where, there was an initiative to lower the 3 strikes initiative. And in the last month, the Republicans, and I'm not sure exactly which case it was.
Well, I think Jerry Brown.
But anyways,
Came up with that
they
one.
changed opinion, in the last 3 weeks of the election, just by raising fears about what this is going to do to crime, and it changed the outcome. So it's one of those issues that I think is susceptible to making claims that just appeal to the fears of people. And again, when that ties in with economic concerns, which are clearly there. I mean, the Democrats are not running in a good political environment with regard to the economy. I remember George Bush Sr., he said if it were just 6 months later, I'd been reelected. And it was because of the economy. It just hadn't turned in his direction. And it was going to turn in about 6 months. But this election is just bad timing for the Democrats.
And on crime, I mean, it's one of those things where there's a difference between the sort of intellectual and policy views people hold and then their emotions, right? So Prop 47 in California is just Republicans, law enforcement, just hammer it, hammer it, hammer it. But repeatedly, when you poll on the actual substance of a lot of those reforms, people still support them in theory. They just want something to blame when something terrible happens, which is totally understandable. And I think, emotions are easier to kind of play in a campaign than actual deep policy discussions. And this is something the governor tried to bring up in the debate we hosted a few weeks ago. Crime's worse in red states. It's worse in red counties. That's true, but that is not what people want to hear when they feel like they can't walk out of their home and get their kids to school in a safe manner, or when their cars are being broken into, things like that. And it's also really easy to conflate property crimes with bigger actual violent crime. And I think that that's another messaging thing we've seen really happen.
What do you think the effects of homelessness?
Well, that's a great example. People talk about homelessness in the same breath as they talk about the murder rate, and those are not the same things, and they don't really have the same causes or solutions, but it feels like something you can't control and it feels unsafe. And so, I mean, but what's remarkable is then you still see Newsom's numbers. I mean, arguably, if anybody owns this, it's Gavin Newsom, right? He's been governor, he's been lieutenant governor, he is the establishment. But on a statewide level, it just doesn't seem like voters are kind of buying what Republicans are selling. There just aren't enough Republicans.
Eric, what do you, or
No,
Go ahead,
the
Rick.
governor's race is really not a two-way race. It's really, what do you think about Gavin
Newsom
Newsom?
versus himself?
Should you reelect him? We went through the recall and they wanted Gavin Newsom. And so he's capitalizing on that. He's not even campaigning. It's, I don't think, if you asked an open-ended question, who's Gavin Newsom's challenger? I don't think a majority of Californians would have a clue.
Well, it's the same thing that you saw with the race for sheriff in LA, just the mirror image. Both of these are referendums on the incumbent, and in Newsom's case, winning the referendum, and in Illinois' case, he's losing. But both of them, the challengers are pretty much unknown.
why do you think Newsom's winning this?
I mean, I think it sort of goes back to the point about just the core partisanship of the state. So if you think about the recall election, before, early in the process, before it was clear what the alternative is, Newsom's polling in the recall did not look good. He looked like he was in danger. But then once it became clear to voters, either Newsom or a very
Larry Elder.
Larry Elder. That's a very different choice, right? And so, I mean, one way to think about it is, in this highly polarized context nationally, we basically have two parties very closely divided, few more Democrats than Republicans nationally, but closely divided, and then a set of people who could split their ticket or vote for either party. And so national elections are just determined by that slice of 5 to 10% who aren't clearly in one party camp, plus the relative turnout of the two party spaces, right? The same thing in California, but we start from a baseline statewide that's more like 60-40, right? So that's so that you can't, so in a bad year, that there just aren't enough of those swing voters in the debate, except in these districts, but in these California districts that are closer to 50-50, those can clearly tip each way based on what the subject of the election is, the mood.
Can I ask Mark, okay, so right now I was looking at the voter reg statistics. It's 2-to-1, like 46% Democrats, 23% Republicans, around 22% independents. Do you feel like those no party preference voters break more towards Democrats?
No question.
And what's the percentage there?
Yeah, no, it's been documented poll after poll, because not only do we have the registration numbers, we always ask in our polls, what's your self-identification? Do you think of yourself as closer to the Democrats or Republicans? Even if you originally say independent, we then push them. And you look at the results there, it looks like the 2-to-1 margin that you see in the overall electorate. So the no party preference voters are another constituency for the Democratic Party in this state.
Why don't you go back a bit to some of Mark's earlier slides, especially the ones on sort of themes that voters seem to think that a divided nation is a bad thing, right? It's a bad thing for democracy, and yet we see the ways in which they are fundamentally entrenched and divided in these ways. What do you think that contradiction is about, Eric?
Well,
they know it's a bad thing, and then they reproduce
they also, the problem is you blame, it's the other side. The reason we're divided is because the other side is unreasonable, and is a threat. And that growth in what's called affective polarization, or negative partisanship, where you view the others, it's not, for the most part, if you look at polling, how people feel about their own party hasn't changed that much over the years, but what they feel about the other parties become just much, much more negative. And so in that context, divisiveness is bad, but the solution is for our side to win.
But one thing that's really striking about this particular moment in time is that even though we're so evenly divided nationally, the outcome of just a 1 or 2 point swing produces such a difference in what happens in policy. That's why it's so nerve-wracking to most voters, because if the Republicans take control of the House and the Senate, it's a totally different world than it is now. So it's a very consequential 2 to 3 point gap. And I think that really raises everybody's temperature a bit.
How about sports betting though, huh? That's not gonna happen. We all agree on that. Kind of wild.
all the things sports betting.
Bring us together.
Yeah, one thing we could be opposed to, or maybe we just want to keep our ability to go to Vegas or something.
What's interesting is all the research, getting back to the polarization, is showing that we're all in different media worlds, right? So the overlay of the media landscape on that. Where are sort of academicians, or where are some of the researchers are saying is sort of the answer here, if anywhere, right? If these sort of trends in public opinion are going this way, these trends in the media landscape are going this way, is there any sort of sense of a difference either from anyone? Is it just
this isn't exactly an answer to that, but I think it's fascinating to think about how we get our information and just the proliferation of mis and disinformation and how to combat that. So on my show this week, we had NPR's Shannon Bond, who's covering dis and misinformation. And she's done some reporting on research around pre-bunking. So this idea of getting ahead of misinformation, if you give people kind of what feels like non-biased sort of setup to things, that they will go in with a more discerning mind when they see misinformation. But that doesn't get at the issue of half of the country believes that the last election was stolen. So And like you can't, once you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube kind of thing. So yes, I think that we can do a better job like with younger people at kind of media literacy and that kind of thing. But also, if we're all just growing up in households that are this polarized, like how do you get through that? Because most people learn a lot about politics from their communities and families, you know?
We do see increasingly since around 2000, so over the last 20 years, a huge and growing split by age on a lot of these issues. So, you know, if you look at the 2020 election, for example, Biden won very heavily voters younger than 45. Trump won voters older than 45. And if you look on a lot of the attitudinal questions about issues of culture and identity that are the ones that are so divisive in American politics, voters who are younger than 45, certainly the ones younger than 30, are very much out of step with where the Republican Party is. So I do think part of the answer of kind of how this plays out over time may simply be that, you know, we're in a moment. It's going to be a difficult transitional moment, but 10 or 15 years down the road, the country may look very different. You know, there's a stereotype that people get more conservative as they get older, but that's really not true. People tend to form their values and stick with them. You know, I think part of what's happening is there's a huge demographic shift in the United States. You know, 1 out of 6 Americans now are foreign born. There's been a huge amount of public discussion about the idea that that white Americans are going to be a minority. There are a lot of conservative white voters who are very anxious about that, and that underlies a lot of the tension. And we may just have to live through this moment until this transition has moved on.
But I think that's probably more true around cultural issues, which is what you're talking about. But we have seen, I mean, if you're talking about Republicans make huge inroads, say with like male Latino voters, there's some thought the African-American males will be leaning more right this time. So I think like, I think it's an interesting question of how that plays out. I mean, I kind of made a joke earlier about like, oh, congressional district is a swing district for now. I think in California, that's true. A lot of these districts, like if you talk to folks, I talked about the Central Valley one, Mike Madrid, a longtime Republican consultant, was saying, he's like, yeah, in a couple of cycles, that's just going to be a Democratic seat. But, you know, of course, well, we have elections then, and we have people being elected who are promising in swing states like, was it Wisconsin? You know, that they will not abide by the vote if they're elected governor and secretaries of state. So like, I don't know, I think it's a fascinating question. And I think that Democrats are struggling with the idea that there are certain demographics that they've sort of taken for granted, and they're not necessarily sort of a guarantee, especially when it comes to questions around the economy.
Some people see the history of California as indicative of this process, Dave, is what you've been talking about, right? So if you look at California in the 1990s, right, Pete Wilson, 187, increasing anxiety about the new majority in California. Now look at California now, right? Mark, you've done some work looking at changes in the California electorate since the 90s to now. You've seen tremendous change.
Right, and I do remember very well that particular election, 1994, 187 was on the ballot. We actually were working with UC at the time. Jack Citron was very interested in this issue, and he basically had me, just want to give this example, he had me poll the entire adult public and ask them about Prop 187, not just likely voters or registered voters. And it was really remarkable because the overall adult population was evenly divided. But as you got closer and closer to the likely electorate, they were more and more in favor of 187. So it really depended on who voted, not what the masses thought. And then it got overturned by the courts. But I still remember that as really different publics. It depends on the voting public or the adult public. And, that's where a lot of these demographic changes really kind of are slow to evolve because there's a lag between changes in the overall population and then the likelihood of the population.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether California is unique in itself or whether California is a harbinger to other states.
It's a hard
Georgia,
one. People have
Arizona.
been talking about Texas is changing and I haven't seen it
Exactly.
yet. Where everybody's holding their breath and saying, well, look at the demographic changes that kind of mirrors what's happening in California, but
But
the politics hasn't changed.
you thought of Texas? What is
No, I sort of an aside, but talking about 187 and thinking about the sort of rise in Latino power in California, and then what just happened with the city council in LA. Like folks like Kevin De Leon came up in politics in large part because they were activated by Prop 187. And unfortunately, it just shows that like just electing a more diverse group of people doesn't mean you like solve racial problems or other, sort of big issues. But yeah, there's definitely like an entire class of very powerful now Latino politicians who, came out of that kind of organizing, especially in college for
I mean,
187.
Padilla.
Yeah, I
Padilla
mean,
is
yeah,
another
he's,
example. So
we'll
you've
keep
got-
him over. I don't think he wants to be associated with De Leon right now. But yeah, for sure. I mean, I think he's the best example and probably the biggest sort of rising star right now in California politics.
Yeah, great. We'll open it up to the audience now. Any questions out there from the audience you might have? Sure.
You used the word upset, and there's two emotions that I would focus on: anger and fear. So defund the police is a fear thing, and then the price tag at the pump is an anger thing. And I was going to ask, how many believe that anxiety subjects were cured by placebo? More than 50% who got a sugar pill were cured. So the answer is 60% are cured by, so if anxiety is cured by anger, then this word upset, if you're talking about two emotions, one feeds, is anybody looking at this at all?
Well, I mean, I think it speaks to the idea of like, what is the role? I mean, as researchers, we're thinking about this all the time. What is the role of emotion and what is the role of actual data in sort of moving the electorate, right? I mean, I think you've done some of this, Eric, or sort of looked at some of this stuff, right? Like, what role is actual data?
Yeah,
playing?
it's hard to get data, especially on complicated policy issues. It's like the visceral, easily observed data points. So gas prices is a data point people can vote off of. Things like crime rates that are harder, it's much more a matter of feeling. I think the objective data on crime is kind of complicated, harder. And so I think that often in politics, data, I would say, takes a backseat, as you said, to emotion.
We have a
So
question.
no one's looking at the seesaw effect of anxiety being cured by anger.
We'll get back to you. And we have a question in the back.
I have this question, like in the beginning of, Mr. David, you were saying like how democracy is getting like kind of bit uncharacterized. I just have this question. Do you think political instability is also a cause of people losing faith upon democracy as, going back to the day 2017 when there was the Mar-a-Lago summit and how we heard that Trump administration had something going else. And when it came to Biden's turn to talk to the WTO and the global level, they had some different opinions. Do you think like constant changes of the government is also hampering the democracy as of today?
Well, I do think when people feel like society is unstable, that makes them feel like the system isn't working. So whether it's governmental instability, I'm not so sure. I don't know, but certainly when people feel like society is unstable, that makes them feel like the democratic system isn't working well.
Question here.
Hello, I'm a lifelong Democrat, and as of right now, I'm not happy where the Democratic Party is going. And I've seen among Latino voters that they are switching to Republican, but some want to keep the Democratic title, but they're considering themselves as conservative Democrats, especially out in LA, because Rick Russo, he's conservative Democrat. That's how I see him as. Like, do you think eventually maybe California will flip red or anything like in 10 to 15 years?
It's an interesting question. Interesting question, and as we were saying earlier, Caruso has done really well among a lot of Latino voters, particularly more politically moderate or politically conservative Latino voters. I think the question for the long term would be: do those voters who see themselves as politically more conservative decide that they want to remain as Democrats and try to make the Democratic Party more conservative, or do they say, well, this isn't working and switch? I think in Florida, for example, you're seeing the latter, that a lot of people have switched to the Republican Party.
Yes.
In California, not so much. And part of that is the history of Pete Wilson and Prop 187, which is a huge barrier, I think, for a lot of people. Where that how that plays out, over the long term, we'll have to watch and see.
Marisa?
Yeah, I would just add that I think Rick Caruso's winning because he became a Democrat.
Yeah.
So like it might be that people, and I think what you're seeing in California is that there's been, because of the real dominance of the Democratic Party, there's almost two parties within the Democratic Party, right? So in Sacramento, you have sort of more progressive, maybe labor-friendly Dems, and then you have more business-friendly Democrats. You could certainly put like Bass and Caruso in those camps. So I think that's more the split. We haven't seen, like there are some peeling off, I think, for Republicans of Latinos, especially young men, but it's not happening the way it's happening in a state like Texas or in Florida. And I think there's still a lot of things that give the Latino community pause in this state, and it's not just around immigration. We're not even talking about immigration in California, right? Like that's not the issue here.
And I think one of the big things is that the two trends are not separate. So Caruso is coming in with tons of money, and then you see, since at least from our data, since July, an increase in Latinx support there. But tons of money into media means tons of money into Spanish language media in a place where, you go into Spanish language media and nobody else is going to there, you've got a monopoly, right? And so I think that's a real thing. And when he can come in with this whole sort of discourse of I'm a business owner, Latinos are one of the most entrepreneurial groups in California, period, especially the second generation. So, a lot of these dynamics are at play. We're talking at breakfast about how, Latino politics researchers for decades have been saying one of the problems with the Democratic Party is that it doesn't invest in outreach to Latino voters until the very last minute, right? And we can turn to the 2020 election for some of those examples. And in many ways, some of these dynamics are coming to play here.
I also like to add, like even Gavin Newsom said, like the Democrats need to stop being on defense. Like we need to go on offense. That's what we're lacking as of right now.
Which is a personality. Like that's something that you like about his personality, which I think, is different than policy, right? So I think that Caruso has that too. And he's like going to actual real places in LA.
He's on
Royal
Instagram.
Heights and stuff. And
He's gonna
we had Gustavo Arellano on our podcast this week, and he's like, he found like the good Mexican restaurants. Like it's not just like AstroTurf.
Just anecdotally, friends in Royal Heights have saying that only this week have they been seeing any Bass walkers or flyers. But another question here.
Do you think the electoral denial movement as a dimension of polarization will outlast Trump?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It already has. Like, it's not just him anymore, right?
Yeah. It's becoming an article of faith in a way that is worrisome. The number of Secretary of State candidates, platform statements in places like Texas, I think it is. And I think with anything like this, what you have to ask, like the thing that prevents that from happening is when you pay an electoral price for doing it, right? So if you think about like doing something extreme or that seems like a norm violation, if you pay an electoral price, then there's a tendency to move back. And what Republicans, I think, are seeing is they're not paying an electoral price, or certainly not much of one. And so I think it's likely to.
Just follow up. So how do we explain that so many tens of millions of our fellow citizens have bought into the electoral denial perspective?
I had an answer for that, I
It's-
probably wouldn't still be a public.
Well, it's leadership, the Republican leadership, and that's the dominant theme. I mean, one of the most striking things I see in our poll is 54% of Republicans don't believe in the integrity of machine ballot counting. Now, come on, a computer is actually changing the vote. That's a really damning thing on elections.
But it's not rational, and you can't argue with, because most of, well, I mean, it's not, what I was gonna say is it's not rational because the argument and a lot of folks are making in swing states is that Donald Trump actually won, but they're on the same ballot. So Marjorie Taylor Greene believes she was duly elected, but that Donald Trump had the election stolen. Like, that doesn't, like, you can't really counter that with facts because it's not a factual argument.
Right. But it resonates.
Yeah, it definitely resonates. And I think people have always had skepticism and concerns about elections, and that's valid because in many countries they're not secure and free.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is when it gets magnified by elites and then by media sources that these voters trust, that creates a different context. So, I mean, there's always been a strain of conspiratorial attitudes, skeptical attitudes
On both
sides.
yeah.
On both sides. I actually remember some time ago, before any of this came about, the question of how many people actually believe their ballot is secret. Lots and lots of Americans, when you ask that question, don't really believe their ballot is secret or didn't believe it. But that hasn't been politicized in this way. And so it hasn't become a problem. But it just suggests the ease with which when political elites and allied media kind of give a microphone to something, the extent to which it can take hold among their core partisans.
Like, historically, vote by mail was used in California overwhelmingly by Republican conservatives. That was who voted early. We used to be able to say, oh, like, it's probably going to skew more blue now because it's election day voting, and that has just been completely blown up. And so it's really, it's really fascinating. Although I will say in some of those like northern counties, like where Brian Daly's from, people do still rely on vote by mail because you have to travel so far, and so I don't know how that's being squared in some of those circles.
Any
I
other?
have a question.
Sure.
So, so now we're seeing a lot of division these days, but we haven't seen division 20 years ago. What were like the contributions that we saw division these days? I mean, like, what are the contributions or factors that we're seeing division, like in 2020, from the election of 2020? And we did not see any type of divisions like 20 years ago.
I think that's an Eric question.
Yeah, something I've studied quite a bit. It's been a gradual process, is what I would say. So 20 years ago, actually political science, we started to get really worried about polarization around 20 years ago. But what's striking is how much worse it's gotten since then. And I think that it's complicated. I think it does all start, or largely start, with the realignment on racial issues that takes hold in the 60s, because what that did, Democrats being identified with racial liberalism, Republicans with racial conservatism, is two things. One, it clarified the party's images. Before that, the images of the two parties were just so diffuse that for lots of voters, they kind of looked the same. And so that's one thing. And then secondly, along with that, meant that voters started to sort themselves into each party based on these things, with their and a lot of social identities that in the past sort of worked at cross purposes started to line up with party together. Race, religion, other kind of gender identities, education, all these started. And so that's sharpened the party images. And then the key is like, well, do people have an incentive to reinforce that or countervail that? And due to things like the changes in the media that Marisa talked about, with the nationalization of the media and the rise of a greater party press, you get incentives, lots of actors incentivized to encourage this division, move it along. And then the politics itself has become so nationalized that it used to be possible for a California Republican to be very different from a Texas Republican, and a Massachusetts Democrat and a Florida Democrat could be really different. Now they're all part of the same networks, raising money from the same people, talking to the same audiences, and that's just pulling it further and further apart.
And don't you think that's also partly because of, economic inequality has also just made everyone sort of more suspicious of institutions and like, you know, in both parties, right? There's a sense that like everyone's corrupt, nobody's helping me.
Yeah.
Yeah, trust in government has plummeted since we've
Yeah.
been polling it.
Yeah, trust in government. And what we also are seeing are trust in institutions that are not political have become much more polarized. Attitudes toward higher education, attitudes toward science,
The
expertise,
Census Bureau.
Census Bureau, and then on the other side toward things like police, you know.
Yeah.
So we see this, all these institutions that used to be sort of have broad diffuse support now are much more D versus R.
And this widespread cynicism speaks to one of the earlier points of the role of emotions, right? Emotions and data, and you know, emotions divorced from data and the way we're thinking about sort of voting preferences.
And I think it also speaks to like why it's been hard for Democrats to like make the argument about democracy, because if you don't trust institutions, why do you want to save them?
Yeah. But the only other thing I would say on that, though, is let's not over romanticize the past.
Yeah,
it's certainly
totally.
true that partisan political polarization as we know it now is a phenomenon that's grown in the last 20 years, but it's not like the country wasn't divided.
Like remember 2000 election?
Or 1968 or 1865. I mean, the country has a long history of deep and sometimes violent division. Often much worse than what we're seeing now. So, while we've got a particular type of it right now, but division itself is not a good thing.
David's making me feel better.
So we've got a big
I'll take
online,
it.
we've got an online audience, and Ezra has a question, and then we'll take a question in the back.
So I wanted to share a comment that was from one of the online participants, and then a question from an online participant. So John Kingdon shared that another way that this midterm is not normal is that usually the president's party gains seats in a presidential year and then loses some of them in an off year. But the Dems actually lost House seats in 2020, so the union pattern doesn't apply. And that was from John Kingdon from the University of Michigan. And then Brad Barber mentioned, you touched on this before, but I would like you to go into more detail. The Latinx Hispanic vote in Texas seems to be more conservative than California. Beyond Prop 187, why is that the case?
That's the question. I mean, there's all kinds of historical aspects to what we're talking about there, right? So not only are they coming into a much more historically blue state as they're coming into California, but they've also got places like urban spaces like Los Angeles where they could mobilize in these urban places. Texas historically has had a much different relationship even to the border. If we think of where the history of Latino racial terror exists in America, I mean, it's only today that we are uncovering places like Portland, Texas, where Texas Rangers had a historical massacre of Latino communities, where we're now knowing that in the 1800s, early 1800s, Latinos were brought out and just shot without impunity just for being Latino. So these are the deep sort of roots of racial terror and racial lynchings that we're uncovering in Texas that were quite different and didn't exist in the same way in California. It's not that California has ever been a racial paradise, but it doesn't have sort of those deep roots. And part of it is the way that Texas has formed its relationship to Mexico as we are the US, you are out there. California was a destination place. California brought in the immigrants from, you didn't have that huge Asian population in the beginning with Texas. So a lot of Texas identity was formed against the border, right? If you look at a place like El Paso, right, it would accept ideas of like, we're a sort of Spanish place, we're a place of sort of colonial architecture, but it had sort of, it was also the site of these places of racial terror. It was almost as if we have some of the culture, but not the people. California, you just have a much different dynamic and different relationship to the border, I would say.
Yeah, I think the border is key there. Like if you look at, because it's not just like white ranchers along the Rio Grande who are frustrated about what's happening with migrants, right? And go down. I mean, I grew up in San Diego. Like it's a totally different relationship here. We also don't have the Rio Grande. It's a less porous border. It's harder to get across in California. But And I think, yeah, like if you look at Tijuana, it's not to say that, border states outside of California don't have economic ties, but I think that like even the former Republican mayor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer, really worked to create that sort of back and forth between Tijuana, and that's not the same kind of politics, I think, in a lot of other places.
California also has a very powerful, politically influential labor movement, which has been a huge part of progressive politics in California. Texas doesn't. Texas is a much more religious state. And as Marisa was saying before, people who go to mass have different political views than people who don't. That's true of people who go regularly to church and Protestant denominations too. So, I mean, there are just a whole huge range of ways in which these two huge states are very, very different.
We'll take the last question back there.
One question is if you can share your assessment of the Californian who might lead the House next, Kevin McCarthy, and any sense of how he will manage his caucus and whether there's any chance for responsible governance or careening towards debt ceiling fights and government shutdowns. If that question's not compelling, if any of you could speak to how YIMBY and housing issues could divide Democratic constituencies in California.
Can Kevin McCarthy lead his caucus?
No. I mean, I don't think so. There's nothing in Kevin McCarthy's history that I've seen. I've watched him now for a number of years that would make me think that he can control the caucus any better than John Boehner or Paul Ryan. But both of them were much more steeped in policy than McCarthy is. He's not trusted by the right, and therefore he has to constantly bend over backwards to convince them that he's on their side. His speakership will be hanging by a thread from the moment he's elected, and I think it will be extremely hard for him to effectively lead the House. I think we're in for a very bumpy ride.
Any thoughts on the housing question?
I mean, I actually think this is one area where California politics has shifted significantly in the past decade, and it's kind of wild to think, conversations about removing local control were, other than Prop 13, kind of the third rail in California and Sacramento just a few years ago, and the tide has shifted. I mean, I saw some, take it with a grain of salt, it was like an internal campaign poll, but in San Francisco, the most popular politician is Scott Wiener. Like, he's outpacing everyone else, including the mayor, who's got pretty kind of even favorable, unfavorable. People like him. And I think what we're seeing, even with some of the endorsements in some of the competing housing measures out there, is a real shift. I think it's partly led by not young voters, but folks in sort of my age group in their 40s who are looking around and see that their parents were able to buy houses and have a comfortable middle class life, and that it's, if not impossible, extremely difficult. So I actually think, like, in a way, that's an area of like hope in this divisive moment, because you do see, I think, some sort of coalescing of people who don't always agree on a lot of things coming together and talking about it. But I mean, there's no silver bullet, right? So I think, like, if I look at the politicians in Sacramento that are most effective over time, it's not always the names that people know statewide. I think if you think about a lot of policies, I've been thinking about doing a story on Mark Leno and just all the stuff he started as a state senator 15 years ago that are finally happening now. I think Scott Wiener is in that same kind of group, and there's others as well, obviously. And I think they are laying the groundwork for a real seat change, but it's going to take time.
And that note, please join me in thanking our panel. Refreshments in the back. Feel free to, yeah.